Do you ever feel like your whole life is just thinking up rewards and punishments to get the young humans in your life to cooperate? Are you ever frustrated by the lack of motivation or unwillingness to go above and beyond that we see in lots of kids? Great news. In today's episode, we're going to continue our How to Become an Inspiring and Powerful Influence in the Lives of Young Humans Around You series. We'll be digging into one of the classics about motivation, punished by rewards, the trouble with gold stars, incentive plans, A's, praise, and other bribes. We'll talk about the root of motivation and some of the ways we can protect a student's intrinsic motivation and build strong relationships along the way. Join us on Leveling Up.
This is Leveling Up, a podcast for educators, parents, and leaders of children who are interested in empowering learners in our schools, homes, and communities. Let's level up.
Hi, welcome back to Leveling Up. I'm your host, Kaity Broadbent. Today we're going to be talking about our second book in our series called How to Become an Inspiring and Powerful Influence in the Lives of Young Humans Around You, which is probably the longest podcast series name that's ever been invented, which is fine. Today our book is Alfie Kohn's Punished by Rewards. The trouble with gold stars, incentive plans, A's, praise, and other bribes. Oh, sounds a little intense. And I will caveat this book recommendation and chat to say that Alfie Kohn's take on this subject is definitely like in a more extreme camp than I currently kind of jive with. I think that punishments and rewards and internal motivation, extrinsic motivation is more of a spectrum, and that we can use these things that he calls bribes, because they are, in specific ways and in specific settings, some of which are very harmful and others which are less harmful. So we'll talk about all of that, but we're going to just kind of focus on the main idea of his book. And if you end up reading this book, you'll read lots of things where you might not agree with him. And I don't necessarily agree with him either, but I think that this book does a great job of covering the basis of kind of what is really at the root of kind of our broad treatment, or like the way that we think about our role as adults and our relationship that we have with young humans around us. So that's why I like this book, and we're just going to talk through some of the concepts. So in this book, Alfie Kohn goes over a concept called behaviorism, and this is a concept in psychology or social science that has something to do with the idea that human behavior is more or less determined by environmental reinforcement. Or said another way, we decide what we're going to do or not do based on what we will get or what will happen to us if we don't do that thing. So said more simply, if you do X, you will get Y. Or if you don't do X, Y will happen to you. So there's kind of a negative framing of that and a more positive framing of that. So there's a lot of really obvious, very neutral applications of this idea. So for example, I might decide that I'm going to do the dishes because my friends are coming over and I want them to think that I have it all together, which I clearly do not. But I want them to think that, so I'm going to do this behavior, right? Or I might go to sleep early to avoid feeling tired in the morning. This is just basic cause and effect, right? And there's nothing really bad about that. I'm just navigating the normal world of cause and effect, and that's fine. I decided that I wanted a certain result, and I acted for myself what course of action I would take to get me there. So some of my motivations might be noble, others might be less so, but I'm doing it myself. But what happens when we start trying to change other people's behavior by introducing conditional rewards or punishments? This is behaviorism. And this is the thing that Alfie Kohn takes issue with. So I want to tell you a story. And I'm a little nervous to tell you this story because it's probably, as an educator and as a adult that interacts with young humans, probably my worst moment. So here we go. So I was a speech language pathologist in the school setting, and I was working with a little boy, and this kid had a reputation in the schools for being very difficult to work with. He was a behavior kid. He was in pullout for sped all day long. He had lots of issues. I would just hear all of the other teachers talk about, oh, we have to, deal with this kid. And so this kid got pulled into my speech room, and I thought, I'm not going to take any monkey business from this kid. I'm going to show him who's boss, because that's how you have to treat this kid to get him to do anything. So, I hate, just like, even thinking about this makes me so sick. So I took a sticker. I let him pick a sticker. See, voice and choice, and such a good facilitator of autonomy. He gets to pick a sticker, and then I held that sticker on my finger in front of his little cute face, and I said, "If your bum leaves your chair, I will rip this sticker up and I will put it in the garbage." And he looked at me like, I was very serious. And he sat in his chair and he did what I asked him until he stood up. And then guess what happened? I ripped that sticker up very dramatically and I put it in the garbage can. Ha! Just showing this kid who is boss. So he sits down again. And I let him pick another sticker, and we play this little game again. We do our session. He does all of his work, and then he goes back to class. And the principal of the school actually came and observed me work with this little boy later. And I was able to control this little boy. And he actually stood me up at a teacher meeting later and celebrated me for being able to control this little boy. And I just, knowing what I know now about how disrespectful that might have felt, and how kind of manipulative and cold that was, just trying to control this little boy. I look back on that and I feel like I wish I had known better then. And this book, actually reading this book a few years ago, for me was one of the things that helped change my thinking here. And this whole episode is not meant to just shame us all in our behavioralist leanings. Behavioralism is so common and so the norm that it's hard to even point out, right? It just kind of feels like how the world works. So, some examples of behaviorism, it's really obvious that they're not okay, right? Maybe ripping a sticker up in front of a little kid's face seems really intense, and it is. It was not a good move. But there are situations where it's even more obvious, if you don't obey me, I will hit you. Things like that. That's obviously over the line. We're using fear to control someone, right? And it's obvious in that situation. And doing that has effects, right? It has consequences. That relationship is not great, maybe, or, that little kid who is receiving that, maybe they're going to have a really hard time managing themselves when there is no threat of violence, right? So we're going to talk through that more later, but in that situation, it's very obviously over the line. But there are so many other iterations of this that are not close to that line, and so they seem fine. But it's really the same principle at work. So some examples of this, I'm just going to kind of read through a list of very common things. These are things that I have done, things that are very normal. So if you've done these things, please don't feel bad. This is not meant to shame anyone. We're just trying to raise our awareness of this concept and this tendency in our minds and in kind of the societal ethos, so that we can be more aware and conscious and intentional of how we treat the young humans around us. Okay, so here's some examples. You're a soccer coach. You have a player who's late for practice and you make them run instead of joining the practice. Seems reasonable. You're driving and you want your kids to stop fighting. So you say, if everyone stops fighting, we'll go get ice cream. You're being positive, right? This is good. You're a 2-year-old. Even kids do this to us. You're a 2-year-old and you want your mom to buy you a toy at the store. So you cry really loudly and you're essentially telling your mom, if you give me the toy, I will stop crying and that will be nice for you, right? It's kind of this reverse. But then in that situation, if you're the mom of the 2-year-old, you could say something like, if you stop crying, when we get home, we will watch Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, or something enjoyable for the kid. to give a teaching example, if you're a teacher and you want your students to do well on a test, you could say anyone who gets an A on the test gets a pizza party. That would be really fun. That makes learning fun, right? You're an administrator who is trying to prepare for an audit or something like that, and you need your teachers to get all of their ducks in a row so you're super compliant. So you start handing out Starbucks gift cards for anyone who has everything in a line, right? All organized. So these are examples of the same principle of do this and you'll get this, or if you don't do this, something bad will happen to you, right? It's the same equation, just on a lesser scale. So it seems like this is just the way the world works. And in reading this book, Alfie really helps us see how playing this game of rewards and punishments all the time is really ineffective. And you might say, what are you talking about? It's very effective, right? And if our intent is to condition short-term obedience, absolutely. It is completely effective, like hands down, very effective. But if our real goal is to get kids to ask the question, what kind of person do I want to be? Or if we want kids to accept challenges and look for difficult things that will really help them grow, or if we want them to grow up to be kind and caring and loving on their own, he's going to go through how this trend that seems very normal to us actually negates all of those things that we think that we want for our kids. So these examples are kind of like one-off things, but if you think about a child's life, they are controlled at almost every point when they are awake. There are very few moments when they aren't under some sort of threat or bribe. And if you're just one person and you're like, well, I only have this one deal that I make with kids, that's you. But then they have a soccer coach and they have a parent and they have a teacher and they have all of these other environments that they're in that they have to learn how to manage. So it really, like, if you think through it, as an example, like you could imagine a kid going to school and being in some sort of classroom economy, right? Sit in your desk quietly, you'll receive praise and access to recess. And then if you talk, maybe you will move your card from green to yellow, from yellow to red. And if you get on red, then you lose recess. And if you get on red for 3 days, then a note goes home to your mom. And then your mom has a deal where if a note comes home, then that means you are grounded or your bike is in timeout. But if you have a really good attitude, maybe you can get your bike back a day early, right? Like there's just constant negotiation going on between adults and kids. So it's kind of like, I imagine it as like a reward and punishment pinball game that kids are going through all the time. And it's exhausting. And the thing that Alfie points out is that this doesn't actually work in the long run. So it works in the short term, doesn't really work in the long run. So he goes through like a litany of research that demonstrates that rewarding people for doing something literally decreases their ability to do it well, which is so fascinating because you'd think like, oh, if you're really motivated, you'll be super focused, you'll, get this stuff done. But according to science, that's the opposite is actually true. So I'm going to go through some research examples. So they did a study with 9-year-olds and they were asked to tell the difference between two smiley faces. Half of the kids were paid for their right answers, and the other half were just told if they were right or wrong. And far and away, the kids that got paid made more mistakes. Another study was done with graduate students, and they were brought in and they were given matches and thumbtacks and a candle. And they were told that their job was to try to figure out how to mount the candle on the wall. And they were supposed to figure out that you could use the box from the matches, thumbtack it to the wall, and then put the candle on top. People who were paid to do this as fast as they could actually took 50% longer to do it than non-paid or non-motivated people, non-rewarded people. Another study talks about how journalism students were being trained to write headlines according to certain criteria. People that were paid per headline, the quality of their work actually just flatlined, never got better. Whereas if you weren't paid, the quality of your work actually increased. The interesting thing is that this research is not just in this book. Like there are countless books that are about this, and I will put some in the show notes. But if you don't want to read this book but still want to learn about this, you could read Daniel Pink's Drive There's another book called Why We Do What We Do by Edward Deci. And Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, they're kind of like the grandfathers of this thing called self-determination theory that really explains like human motivation. And it's very counter to behaviorism, actually. So it's a really interesting read. And then the other good one here is called Nurture Shock that presents all of this research as well. So it's a pretty sound conclusion. There's a lot of studies out there that show that when we reward people, we actually negate their ability to do well, which is just mind-blowing because it just seems so counterintuitive, but it's true. This has even been shown in studies about kids playing with toys or drawing, doing things that are naturally enjoyable. They'll take two groups of kids and say, you can draw or you can play with this toy. And then they'll study how long and how creatively that group of kids plays with the toy, how often they choose to play with that toy or do that activity. And then they'll have another group of kids where they will incentivize playing with a specific toy or doing it in a specific way or drawing. And then over time, these kids become less, like their interest in doing these things that have been incentivized just wanes, even though the incentive is still there. Even they just lose interest in it, and the incentive becomes not worth it to them because the thing itself, the thing that used to be enjoyable, has been turned into work, which is super interesting because if you think about it, learning in general is a super enjoyable thing to do, right? Humans are built to learn. We're naturally curious. It's very interesting to learn a new thing. But as soon as we start punishing or rewarding around learning, it turns it into work, which then naturally decreases our willingness and children's willingness to participate in those activities in the same way that it decreases their interest in playing with that toy or doing that activity that they used to enjoy. Essentially what we're doing is we're teaching the brain like, oh, I'm getting paid in some way or another to do this thing. If someone has to pay me to do this, then it's probably work. So then your brain just kind of categorizes that thing as work. And you can see this, like imagine if I had a plate of cookies and I came in and one day I said, here's a whole plate of cookies, like enjoy. And then you're like, oh, these cookies are so good. Thank you so much. This is awesome. And then the next day I said, here's your cookies. And you said, I don't really want any cookies, even though they're enjoyable. And you said, I'll give you $1 for every one that you eat. And you did that day after day. You would literally turn eating cookies into a job. And that person would come to think like, oh, like I want to go get some money, so I have to go eat those cookies. Like, and it seems so ridiculous that you could turn something that innately enjoyable into work, but it happens all the time. So let's dig into this idea about learning more. Alfie talks a lot about grades specifically and the negative effects that they have on student engagement and motivation and ability to do well. So it's really interesting because we kind of have this stereotype of kids that like they're lazy or like they just want to do the bare minimum or like they always are choosing like the easy way out. And then we make that mean that like, oh, like they're just not motivated, or like we make that mean something about them when really, if you think about the cause and effect, like punishment and reward structures that we've built for them, they're actually acting completely logically, right? If I tell my kids, your job is to get A's, right? And I might not say this sentence to them directly, but in lots of ways we communicate to our kids, like your job is bring home A's. We are happy when you bring home A's. You get money when you bring home A's. You get privileges when you bring home A's. Lots of good things happen to you when you get A's. That's your job. And then the teacher at school says, hey, we're gonna do a book report and you can choose from these books what book report you want to do or what book you want to do your report on. And some of the books are really long and challenging and others are shorter. And what that student thinks is my job's to get A's. So choosing that hard, challenging book is not the path to accomplishing my goal of A, right? It's actually choosing the shorter book. And then, so they do that, they make that very logical choice. And we think, I wish he would challenge himself, right? But we're actually incentivizing him not to challenge himself, to take the easy way out, to do the bare minimum. If I already have an A in a class, why would I like go the extra mile? Why would I, research something that I don't have to? Why would I learn something that's not on the test, right? We have all of these accountabilities put on kids, and then we ask them to dare greatly and things like that. It's like, we really have to decouple these things and realize that they're competing incentive structures that really conflict with each other. Another thing that Alfie points out is that the behaviors that we want to see or want to not see are only persistent as long as the reward or punishment is in place. For example, if we have a sticker system that rewards kids for being kind, when the adult's there and can see that they're being kind and to give the sticker, like that behavior will be reinforced. But as soon as they're on the playground or as soon as there's no one watching them, they're no longer incentivized to make that good choice, to be helpful, to be kind. So then they have no reason. They haven't internalized the why behind doing that kind or helpful thing. And so they're not like, they don't have an internal schema that holds themselves accountable to that higher ideal, because we've just been trying to shortcut to get the short-term behavior instead of build the deep understanding and meaning and purpose behind that behavior. Alfie has a great quote about this. He says, "Children who come to believe that their prosocial behavior reflects values or dispositions in themselves have internal structures that can generate behavior across settings and without external pressures. By contrast, children who view their prosocial conduct as compliance with external authority will act prosocially only when they believe external pressures are present." So here's another thing to think about. We don't just do this stuff with grades, right? We actually do this with our relationships, right? We smile warmly at kids who pay attention and do well, and we speak a little more sharply to kids who chat during class and struggle to keep a C average. We talk proudly to our neighbors about the exciting achievements of our kids, and we try to avoid embarrassing topics about ways they could be doing better. And subconsciously, this teaches them that our love or approval is actually conditional upon their performance. And I know that no one would ever do that, like, consciously, but it's happening nonetheless. And our love and approval is something so important to our children or to our class, or to our coworkers. Even like we want to be thought well of, we want to be accepted. It's very important to our survival brain and our emotional brains to be able to feel like accepted and approved of. So essentially, when we withhold our like pride or our congratulations or our enthusiasm for a student or a child who is struggling, we're essentially teaching him that like, when you perform, I will be happy. And when until then, I'm unhappy with you. And this, it seems kind of extreme, but I want to tell you a story. And this story is going to make my dad sound like kind of terrible, but my dad was a great person. I love him so much. And I'm actually really grateful for this experience because it's helped me really internalize how important it is to send a message of unconditional love to the young humans in our lives. So here's my story. Essentially, when I was little, I overheard my brother, who is like 5 or 6 years older than me. He really struggled at school. He did not do well, and had a sister who's like 10 years older than me, who was student body class president and valedictorian. It was just awesome. And so I'm just watching this kind of exchange, and my dad told my brother, "If you bring home grades like your sister, you'll walk on water around here." Like essentially communicating to him that grades is the currency of love in our house. And so I knew that growing up, and I, try as I might, could never get straight A's. I liked school. I was just a solid B+ kid. You know, I could never put it over the line. Until I was like a junior in college, I had one semester where I finally got a solid straight line of A's, and my dad happened to be visiting me, and I showed him, and he said, "That's excellent, Kaity. I love you." And that sounds like totally normal, but my dad did not say "I love you" ever, right? And that was actually the first time in my life that he'd ever said those words to me, which sounds like totally crazy. He just wasn't like a very emotionally like warm person, and he showed love for me in many other ways, and I knew that he loved me, but that was the action item that I had to achieve to actually get him to say "I love you," was very instructive to me. And at that moment I realized, wow, I never want to create these conditions for another child, my own kids or any kids that I come to be involved with or educate. I want to set an example of unconditional love. And that's so powerful because when kids feel that you love them, regardless of their performance, they can relax their emotional brains and their survival brain, and they can actually start to use their thinking brain, their thinking cortex. And then they can actually achieve more, right? It's so important that we set this foundation for kids. I love this Alfie quote. I'm going to share it with you. He says, rewards rupture relationship. They open up an enormous chasm between the parent and the child, now defined as the rewarder and the rewarded. There is a significant difference between developing a caring alliance of openness and trust with children and offering rewards to elicit certain behaviors. I love that. He actually has so many good quotes in here. Here's another one. Okay. It is not less controlling to offer goodies for a desired behavior than to threaten sanctions for its absence. A controlling paradigm does not help children act responsibly. Rewards do not make children any more autonomous than punishment. The child motivated by rewards is governed by others just as much as the child who is good only to avoid being punished. And then one last Alfie quote. Sorry, I know quotes get long, but this is such a good one. He kind of sums up this whole idea when he says, a strategy that relies on punishment or consequences prompts the child to wonder, what am I supposed to do and what will happen to me if I don't do it? A strategy based on rewards leads the child to ask, what am I supposed to do and what will I get for doing it? What we are after is children who ask themselves, what kind of person do I want to be? And I think that's so, so powerful and is at the root of why in Prenda we talk so much about our purpose. That should be the motivation. The root of the child's motivation is this purpose. And when we layer on so many rewards and punishments and kind of this behavioralism ping pong game, it distracts from that purpose and it sends a confusing message. Am I supposed to be doing the things that are connected to my purpose? Am I supposed to be doing that with interest and intention and curiosity? Or am I supposed to bring home A's? Sometimes those can be similar and sometimes they are pretty mutually exclusive. So we just need to be cognizant of the environments that we're putting these kids in. And the great news is that it's pretty simple to shift your mindset and how you treat kids in this regard. So we're just going to go through a quick list of examples of how it looks to be a different way. And then next episode, we're going to do a super deep dive into what this looks like, what doing this a different way might look like. Can look like 1,000 different ways, but there are some really important principles and practices that we can go over in our next episode that will really help. But for now, kind of the short version is that engaging kids in conversation about their purpose, like we talked about just now and also a few episodes ago. So what does this other way of thinking look like? Well, it looks like a lot like how we interact with other adults, actually. And I know that the adult-child relationship isn't entirely the same as the adult-peer relationship, and it shouldn't be. We shouldn't just be friends of our kids and not give them any boundaries or rules or consequences. That's not our message. But it can look a little bit more like that than it does sometimes. So it looks a lot like just engaging kids in conversations about their purpose and helping them find the reason why they might want to start doing those things that might be in their best interest that we're trying to bribe them to do. It looks like celebrating struggle and being vocally proud of your kids when they engage in challenges instead of just when they succeed, right? So imagine your 13-year-old daughter who's struggling in math and she overhears you say to your neighbor in one case, oh yeah, she's really struggling in math. I don't know what to do. Like, we're really worried about it. Or she could overhear you say something like, yeah, she's really struggling in math, but she's sticking with it and I'm really proud of her. Like, that sends a very different message to that child. Another way it can look is helping kids make deals with themselves. Kids live in a very resource-constrained environment where adults actually control access to almost everything. Entertainment, food, candy, anything enjoyable. We pretty much, screens, like whatever it is, we have it under lock and key. So kids have a hard time accessing all of these things without making deals with adults, right? And so a way that we can come to this table with a little bit more respect and giving the student more autonomy over how he will maybe motivate himself. I mean, adults use extrinsic motivation on ourselves all the time. You say things like, oh, if I eat healthy all day or all week, then I'll get a splurge day. Or I remember one time I was writing a paper it had to be 30 pages long. And I took some white chocolate chips and I put a line of 30 of them on my desk. And every time I wrote a page, I ate a chocolate chip. Like, we do these things to ourselves, which is more okay, more better than other people doing them to ourselves, right? I mean, the best case scenario is that I would just be so full of desire to write that paper that I wouldn't need any motivation to do it, right? But life's not like that, right? We have to do things that we don't want to do sometimes. And so it's important that we find healthier ways to motivate ourselves, even if that means leaning on the extrinsic motivation a little bit, helping a student do that for themselves. So say something like, it seems like you're having a hard time really staying focused or accomplishing this goal or something like that. Maybe we could think of something fun you could do if you hit this goal. What would you like to do if you hit this goal? How would you like to celebrate this accomplishment? And then we can, negotiate something reasonable that the adult could provide, but the student has been given a little bit more say in that. And the adult is not just dangling the carrot or threatening the stick, right? The goal here is to engage kids in meaningful conversations and to build relationships and environments that help kids learn to govern themselves, right? To not need some external force to control them, but to be able to do that for the right reasons and be accountable for the pursuit of excellence because they want to hold themselves to that standard, not because someone else is doing it for them. And to be kind and helpful because it's the right thing to do, not because they're going to get something or avoid a punishment. So that's pretty much it. Next week, we'll do a deep dive into what these conversations sound like in episode 11. And your challenge this week is to just think. You don't even really need to do anything. Just think about the layers of motivation in the lives of the young kids around you and try to peel off, if you want to, think about one layer that you could peel off, either a reward or a punishment, and you could replace that with a conversation about meaning and purpose. So that is your challenge. I've had so much fun talking to you about these things today. So that's our episode. Thanks for joining us on Leveling Up. You've got this.
Thanks for joining today. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to like and subscribe to the podcast and share with a friend. If you're interested in learning more about Prenda, you can check out their website at prenda.com. And finally, the opinions and comments shared in this podcast are not the official opinions and comments of Prenda. The purpose of this podcast is to continue an ongoing conversation about education and empowerment.